Hey, good morning, James, or good afternoon. I think you're in Massachusetts, is that right?
Yep, it's just after the afternoon now.
Nice.
Good morning, good afternoon, good day to you.
Yeah, great to connect. I know it's been a long time coming. Um,
Yeah, there's
yeah,
a growing community of people. I don't know if it's really a community, but a group of people interested in process philosophy in a broader sense than Whitehead. And this is the first real conversation that I've had with anyone interested in it, despite having written my PhD on the topic.
nice. Well, glad to break the ice.
Hmm.
So yeah, I guess before we get into your paper, which I found really excellent and convergent with a lot of my interest and thinking. Tell me a bit about your own background. So you're at Bentley University, right? And it sounds like you studied anthropology for your BA, consciousness at Goddard College for your MA, and then PhD from University of Canterbury, which was in philosophy, I'm guessing, and that led to your book with Palgrave recently.
Mhm. Yes. So yeah, that's that's quite a story. So there's parts of that story that are like professionally able to be conveyed to the wider world, and there's parts that I suppose can't yet be because I'm not in a stable enough situation to be able to sort of assert them. But eh, roughly, I've always been interested in the nature of humanity and culture, and I was initially attracted to the idea of trying to find universals in human experience. And so I was looking at it through actually art prior to anthropology, but my first degree was in anthropology and sociology. Uh, so it's funny that my own trajectory kind of mirrored, in some sense, the evolution of thought, I think. And it didn't occur to me that that was happening until like some years after I even got my PhD. But the idea is like, well, so there's creative endeavors that are universal, perhaps, and then that led me to culture. And I thought maybe I can more systematically study these things that I'm intuitively endeavoring to understand by looking at it anthropologically. And the questions that I was asking, like in my third and fourth year, my professors were really uncomfortable with. They said, we're not in the business of figuring out universals about humanity. They were like, it's nice that you're interested in trying to find these common threads across religion. That's cool. Do that. But don't be asserting that you've actually found such things, because that's not what anthropologists say or do. And so I was a little bit dissatisfied with that. And then I moved on to consciousness studies at Goddard, and there it was closer to something like a universal. So I got in initially to sort of building off of the spiritual interest that I had and the religious interest. I got into Jungian psychotherapy and transpersonal psychology and some of the criticisms of it. So I was actually really close to going to CIIS. I was unofficially accepted when I was looking for a master's program. So it's funny, a very small difference in my life, and I could have been much closer to you actually. Probably would have ended up in the same programs. Yeah, so I can
Was
get
that
carried away.
the philosophy program that you would apply to,
Um,
MA?
yeah.
Oh, great.
So I didn't actually apply to the consciousness cosmology. Yeah, what is it?
Philosophy,
Philosophy of
cosmology, and
consciousness. Yeah,
consciousness. Yeah.
right. I didn't officially apply, but I reached out to whoever it was that was the head at the time and had a conversation with him and told him what I was interested in. He said, if I
Yeah.
apply, then I will be accepted. He would accept me. So I was like, oh, that's nice. And I was really interested in what was being done out there and the history of the institute. I really appreciated its efforts, and it seems like recently the kind of developments that have taken place in psychedelic research and the combinations between cosmology and philosophy and mythological interest, like all of this has really returned in a new and spectacular way, which seems to me to put your institute in the limelight in some way. It's almost like there was a betting process on that being valuable, and like the rest of society kind of shunned it, and now it's coming back with especially with like Vervaeke and that whole community putting attention on it, and the process philosophy is sort of coming back as well. So that's pretty cool that that you're right there in the middle of it. And yeah, so the rest of the story is I found myself dissatisfied with psychology as well, and with consciousness studies, because of the as I moved from transpersonal studies into consciousness studies, I found that inadequate, because the interest in philosophy of mind, the way that it was being discussed, to put it simply, there were a lot of assumptions about what nature is. There's assumptions about what the world is, and all of that needs to be addressed. And it seemed to me that you can't even really say much of anything about consciousness without saying something about the context in which it arises. So this means talking about nature, talking about laws of nature, or some kind of spiritual domain. And it's like, I wondered then if there was any way to get out of that sort of quandary, because I was very dissatisfied with the conclusions that most of philosophy of mind resulted in. I was like, this doesn't seem to really be clarifying anything. It's just showing how we use language, qualia and stuff like that, and reductivism. But anyway, yeah, that brought me to an interest in metaphysics of science as a way to, it combined with phenomenology as a way to address the hard problem of consciousness. I thought both needed to be dealt with at the same time. So that's what I've been doing for a while now, for I don't know, about 10 years, half of my career. And it doesn't, I can't really find anyone who's doing quite that. But Whitehead and people who follow him seem to be in the same basic area, but drawing from different material and making different kinds of arguments in different spaces entirely than quite my approach, which is why it's interesting to talk to you and try to create bridges, I think. That's
Yeah,
the
really,
story briefly.
really interesting trajectory that I can relate to myself,
Hmm.
having studied cognitive science as an undergrad, but really being interested in consciousness. And this was like 2004 to 2007 uh, that I did my undergrad. And even back then, consciousness was still marginal as a topic of serious inquiry for even in cognitive science.
Hmm.
But it was starting to shift. I think the Journal of Consciousness Studies launched in like 2000, maybe 2002. Um, but now at this point, consciousness is a major hot topic and taken very seriously uh, in cog sci and philosophy of mind in neuroscience. But there's still a lot of confusion, just as you're saying, because the concept of nature that underlies it all um, requires some metaphysical excavation, and very few people are prepared to do that
Hmm.
because things have gotten so sedimented. Certain habits of thought die hard, I guess,
Hmm.
despite the fact that that physics has moved on
Hmm.
from this old concept of nature that was, part of the rise of science in the 17th century. The mechanism, simply located matter, and all of that. It still seems to there's a residue of that in so
Hmm.
much contemporary philosophy of mind. But you're doing work that's really getting to the bottom of this. I haven't read your book yet, um, which is a phenomenological revision of Errol E. Harris's dialectical holism. I take it you bring Harris into dialogue with David Bohm in this book, right?
Hmm.
Another really remarkable physicist influenced by Whitehead to some degree. But
Hmm.
since I haven't read that yet, I mean, we could talk about the book a bit if you want. But a
Hmm.
related paper that you wrote 2002 that was in the Journal of Mind and Behavior towards a phenomenological ontology, synthetic a priori reasoning, and the cosmological anthropic principle. And this was a very exciting read for me because while you're sympathetic to the phenomenological approach, because it does, by bracketing the natural attitude, it allows us to get to um, experience as a kind of uh, condition of possibility, right, from out of which any scientific abstractions would come. And a lot of the issues that arise in, more or less physicalist consciousness studies or philosophy of mind is that it tries to explain experience by reference to the abstractions that would have come out of this experiential ground. And so it seems to be putting the cart before the horse in some sense.
Yes.
Um, but you're also at the end of the day dissatisfied with phenomenology and where it ends up because it lacks it's too what ontologically quietist or metaphysically non-committal, let's say.
Yes.
And
Yes.
so you
That's
draw
right.
on Harris to fill in some of these gaps. Do you want to kind of run us through the basic
Yes.
argument
Okay.
of this paper?
So, okay. I'll start with right. The basic argument is, so Harris is a Hegelian, or he started as a Hegelian. The interesting thing that I like to say about him to sort of get him off the ground for people is that he was born the same year as Merleau-Ponty, but his life was twice as long, and he researched twice as much space as Merleau-Ponty did, and he incorporated Merleau-Ponty's theories along with the rest of phenomenology and a large swath of the history of philosophy. And he also then was integrating the most dramatic transformations that were happening in science as they were occurring. He was studying them and going to conferences and really paying attention to the developments in systems biology and quantum mechanics and consciousness studies before it was even a field. And he was pointing to consciousness studies being a thing that integrated all of this. And amazingly, despite having done that for 70 years, nobody paid him much attention, except a small number of people. And I think that this,
Yeah, I just to
yeah,
say I had only read his translation
mm,
with Peter Heath of Schelling's Ideas for Philosophy of Nature, but I had known about him as a important Hegelian philosopher in the 20th century that kind of updated Hegel in light of 20th century science. But yeah, I really have to credit you with cluing me into the fact that I need to spend more time with his work. So thank you for that. But please,
mm.
yeah, continue.
Right, right. So that's usually what ends up happening is people will perhaps be familiar in passing with some part of what he did, but actually the real systematic work of his began in 65. I mentioned that in an email to you when he wrote his Foundations of Metaphysics and Science. And in there he was trying to bring together all the discoveries of sciences. He understood them and allow them to be informed by something like a sort of neo-Hegelian line of thought. And what he was doing there, so to put it really simply, what I'm doing more recently is inspired by Harris's work, and it also allows me to have a kind of launching point for saying why it's relevant today. I'm working on trying to expand contemporary phenomenology in such a way that it, I think, would act more responsibly for what its real role is. A way to put this very tangibly and simply is to say that, okay, so Merleau-Ponty was fond of talking about canes and the way they shape our sensory motor feedback loop. They shape a tool like that shapes our cognition. If we were blind, for example, it extends it. Heidegger was fond of talking about hammers and the way our tools might stop working and cause us to have to reflect on the way that we're using them. They're no longer transparent, they become opaque, and we question them, right? Things like this are spectacular examples of how phenomenology is necessarily extended into the objects that we use. What I find astonishing is that since Heidegger, since Merleau-Ponty, there's been a really amazing resistance by phenomenologists to the idea of paying attention to how we are extended into all our technology that science gives us, even the practices of science and the psychotechnology of metaphysics itself. So the idea of somehow separating phenomenology from the practice and the procedures of science or metaphysics is insane to me. And it's actually just a kind of laziness and a result of fragmentation in academia, which I think is driven by financial interests. And I think that's actually the residue that you were referring to earlier. The mechanistic approach in most disciplines anyway today, it translates into this fragmented idea of how progress is to be unfolding, should be unfolded. And anyway, the whole point that Harris, Bohm, and activism, what they have in common is this idea of wholeness and self-differentiated unity. And that becomes an epistemology, phenomenology, a basis for metaphysics and ethics. And I think on this point, when we explore it and when we expand it, I think there's a lot of intersections between your work and what I'm on about.
Yeah, thank you for laying that out. There's been at least some attempt to keep this understanding of tools as cognitive extension alive in phenomenology with people like Bernard Stiegler and others, but it's still it's still a marginal perspective, it seems. Despite 4EA cognitive science really coming into its own more recently. I've heard some people describe it as now the dominant approach in the cognitive sciences, which when I was an undergraduate, that definitely was not the case. It was still considered marginal. So something has shifted in what I would consider to be a positive direction, but there's still work left to do, which is, why I find what you're up to so interesting. Let me read a line or two from page 7 of your article, which I found especially congruent with my own work. You said that the fundamental evolutionary process that has resulted in consciousness may be recognized within the generative dynamics of consciousness itself. This means that Harris includes within this historical analysis a phenomenological account of how one's sense of self and world as a whole co-emerge in and through evolution, broadly construed. He contends that an explication of this process may provide a non-reductive ontological foundation and guiding principles within the metaphysics of science. So, as you lay out in more detail in the article, you're basically taking Husserl's generative phenomenology and extending it beyond just culture and history into natural history. And this really jumped out at me because I've done some work drawing on Schelling, and really trying to carry forward what he attempts in his Ages of the World project, which you could call a kind of cosmic anamnesis. That, in other words, prior evolutionary stages of development are actually accessible to us experientially, and that we can, in a sense, I mean, it's based on the loose principle, which I know developmental biologists have challenged in its details, but I think as a general principle, ontogeny recapitulating phylogeny, basically, it maps, it works. It's just you have to be careful about the details when you're actually doing embryology. But as a general principle, human beings, as you said yourself earlier, we seem to go through in our development through infancy, childhood, adolescence, and adulthood, something like the history of the species. Now, I know this can be critiqued in all sorts of ways. What I wouldn't want to end up doing as a result of that kind of schematic is saying that, like, indigenous people were the childhood of humanity. It's not that simple. But there is a sense in which I think what you're suggesting in this statement, drawing on Harris, is that there is a phenomenological access point to not just the structure of human experience, but the structure of experience as such. And in a Whiteheadian panexperientialist sense, that experiential structure goes quite far down indeed, historically, to, for Whitehead, all all of the universe down to the simplest forms of self-organization would be imbued with experience to some degree. And so
Mhm.
the idea would be that we can distill our own human consciousness down to its basal elements and in some sense know from the inside out um, what it's like to be even simpler forms um, of self-organization, you know,
Mhm.
atoms, photons, etc. Now, I don't know if you're going quite that far, but that's kind of what I saw you opening the door to a little bit, some kind
Mhm.
of panexperientialism here,
Right.
as I would call it in the Whiteheadian context. So tell me more about what you're getting at here and how you would articulate it and whether it's different from what I'm suggesting here.
Yeah. I think yeah, that's one of the most important claims in all of the work, really. It requires all of the work to unpack it. But so some of what you're saying was congruent with the idea. So the simplest way to put it is that if we posit being as some kind of wholeness, a whole being, and we then end up with the idea of self-differentiation when we imagine going back, generatively in a phenomenological sense to the origin of anything, whether it's the origin of our consciousness or the origin of reality. The framework for that always ends up kind of ending in this point of homogeneity, or the closest to homogeneity that we can. And that's the case for, yeah, for our consciousness and for any conception of being at all. So this is Harris's starting point, and as you are certainly aware, it's basically Hegel's starting point. But Harris tries to uh, clarify it and develop it quite a bit. So what we end up with is something like a fractal structure where if we go back to the origin of our understanding of our own being, and we try to unpack the conditions of its development into the self-awareness that we have at the moment, it is going to, in some sense, bear resemblance to the self-differentiation of reality, at least in the pragmatic sense, saying that however we conceive of reality, it's going to have a similar structure. Uh, it can't not do so because it is literally the horizon of reality that we're imagining evolving when we're imagining the development of our own consciousness. So this is really the important thing that I'm now trying to point at in the writing that I'm doing now for the current book, which is Process Phenomenology. It's a metaphysical revision of phenomenology. The idea is that there's a coincidence between the conception of a phenomenological horizon and any conception of objective being. And when we identify that coincidence, we can then begin to do work that's simultaneously metaphysical and phenomenological and see how the two are conditioning each other. The logical structures that we have are putting constraints on however we're doing phenomenology, and however our phenomenology is structured is implicitly giving rise to certain metaphysical forms, right? This feedback loop between our concept of nature and our concept of our own consciousness, I think this is basically what the blind spot was trying to get at. And that's really what the blind spot ends up being. Yeah, so I'll leave it there for the moment. What do you think? I can go into more detail of any of that, but
Yeah, no, I like what you're saying about uh, this sort of fractal way in which phenomenology and our attempt to understand the nature of being as such end up being self-similar. Uh, it's kind of an anthropic principle at work. We could only know the world that could have created us.
mhm,
And there are ways of construing that kind of anthropic principle that are it can be construed as tautological in a really mundane kind of so what way. But I think the way
mhm,
that you unpack it, um, it can so easily shift from silly sounding to profound when you really get the participatory nature of this
Mm,
anthropic reasoning. And I know you have a whole section on this, and it's one of the sections in the paper where you get into dialogue with Evan Thompson's work a little bit, who's of course one of the co-authors of The Blind Spot. And there's a point in that book that Thompson co-authors with Gleiser and Frank, two physicists, where they talk about this strange loop, and they draw on Douglas Hofstadter's idea between the scientific picture of the universe, where the human being is peripheral, and the phenomenological picture, where the human being and the horizon of our experience is central in a way. And they don't really resolve that strange loop. They just sort of leave
mm,
it there and say,
right.
we can't get rid of the centrality of experience. Science also, has challenged anthropocentrism, and they just sort of leave us with that. And I think you're pushing a little bit further.
Mhm.
Um, do you want to
Yep.
do you want to lay that
So
out a little bit? Yeah.
I find it really amazing. There's been a number of authors recently who have recognized Torsian, a kind of Mobius strip structure to experience in our conception of nature, or a Klein bottle structure. But what's really kind of weird to me is that Thompson didn't cite anyone who came before him really who tried to develop this idea. I was one of them, and Stephen Rosen was another. He wrote a whole book just on that, actually, and he appealed to Merleau-Ponty to do it. I recommend it. Take a look at his Self-Evolving Cosmos. So I worked on that as extensively as I could in the final chapter of my book. I tried to make sense of that loop. And to me, I think we can initially see it in a kind of trivial way as a structure of our epistemology, where any conception of nature that we have must include the conceiver, right? This is like second order cybernetics stuff. And it's just a kind of constraint on our knowledge, on our epistemology. But when we consider from a pragmatic perspective what Peirce said, so if we don't imagine under any investigation in the future that the idea we're working with is going to be challenged or changed, it becomes at least uh, a kind of ontological principle that sort of stands in for ontology, a working ontological hypothesis. And I think that's what ends up happening with this loop, where we can uh, reify it, and we have to reify it because we're embedded in it. And it's the nature of consciousness. It's the nature of consciousness's relationship to the cosmos. But more specifically, you can unpack this a bit more just by recognizing that, oh, right, the conception of being that we started with was a self-differentiating process. In that framework, there's no part of that process that could be what it is without its particular relationships to the rest. There is no such thing as intrinsic identity. Everything is internally related. Again, this is a point that we would probably agree on. Uh, just that line of reasoning, right? It means that in our epistemology, then, if we're saying that we can't remove ourselves from our conception of nature epistemically, and there's a coincidence between the self-differentiation of our horizon and our conception of nature, whatever it is, that the two end up being identical in a pragmatic sense, and then they're taken to be ontological. So that's the line of reasoning roughly. So it basically goes from a weak anthropic principle to a teleological anthropic principle. And it is a transformation of Hegel's culminating idea, which I would have to unpack much more.
Right. So there's definitely a convergence in regards to the importance of internal relations and the lack of isolated existence, that such a thing can be conceived abstractly, but in reality, there can be no such thing. Um, Whitehead obviously develops this idea of internal relations, which he was a deep reader and appreciator of another idealist, I guess the most popular British idealist in the 19th century, F.H. Bradley, um, who is sometimes misconstrued or misunderstood, largely as a result of Bertrand Russell and G.E. Moore's criticisms, as having the idea is that Bradley emphasized internal relations over external relations. Um, and Russell wanted logical atomism and to clarify our thinking with his analytic methods, so he didn't like the idea of internal relations. But on my reading of F.H. Bradley, he was trying to undermine the idea of relations as such, as kind of incoherent. Um, and Whitehead ends up, rather than saying the idea of relations is incoherent, he wants to articulate a new ontology where we could make sense of both external and internal relations, though certainly internal relations have to be given their due and are given their due by Whitehead in a way that they're not in substance ontologies. But Whitehead ends up saying that while actual occasions of experience, which is one of his core categories, are internally related to the occasions in their past, they're externally related to occasions in their future. So there's a kind of temporalization of ontology here that becomes very important. So everything that already exists is internally related, but future potentials were externally related to those. That would be Whitehead's way of construing it in a nutshell. And I know that Harris has dealt at some length with Whitehead's thought, and he's very appreciative, but also challenges some of Whitehead's empiricist uh, assumptions. In his other book that I was just reading earlier today, Nature, Mind, and Modern Science, he spends, probably 20 pages at the end of that book really going into the philosophy of organism, and he talks about what he calls Whitehead's vacillation from a more idealistic perspective to a empiricist perspective, which I appreciate that tension Whitehead tries to hold, but it's really, really interesting to read Harris's criticisms of Whitehead, and he sees the Hegelian aspects of Whitehead's thought, which again, obviously he wants to amplify. And he's helping me see maybe some of the limitations of Whitehead's approach. But I wonder, you seem like your home base is Harris's Hegelian approach. You're very interested in Whitehead, but how do you see this this interface, whether it's between Whitehead and Hegel or between Whitehead and Harris? What's compatible, and where do you think there might be some tensions there?
Great. Okay, now we get into it. So
Yeah.
It seems to me that the actual occasions, so far as I understand them, that the structure of drawing from the past and ideal forms of God, however those are articulated, in order to creatively produce the next moment. That I think that is it's unnecessary to appeal to a lot of those metaphysical features. So I think that when we are talking about structures of nature or reality that are presumably in our context, that are not us, we have to be careful not to project features of our phenomenology onto it. So this is, of course, the hardest part of doing metaphysics proper. And I appreciate a lot of what Whitehead put forth, but I think that there are certain points that I have rejected out of hand, and that's one of them, actually. So I think that so identity to me would be a trajectory of some process in relation to the whole. And so that trajectory is, of course, internally related to itself and to its context, all the way through to the end of its being. So making that distinction, I'm not sure why one would want to do that between the internal relation to the past and not for the future. And the main point, though, of disagreement is this notion of creativity. So that's the bit that I think is a kind of projection. I think that it can be reframed as things not repeating, but I think that's a feature of like a complex system and evolution. I don't see why we have to refer to it as creativity, or that there would be any form of prehension going on. Things are in relation to each other, and in a Bohmian sense, maybe I should just stop there. There's a bit more detail that I can say about how things relate, but I take a Bohmian approach, so everything's determined, and it's like everything is in relation to everything else, and that's what makes it determined. But nothing has to feel anything else in order to end up doing what it does.
Right, right. Yeah, so as much as there's so much resonance between Bohm and Whitehead, the sticking point is always on this question of creativity.
Mm,
And I think Bohm's system, in Bohm's system, it's clear that at the level of the implicate order, everything's determined.
mm,
There's no freedom at the explicate level because that would require some kind of external relations
mm,
um, for an individual to do something creative that's not already implicit in the whole.
mm,
Um, and yet Bohm wanted to, when he was sort of in conversation, and the Center for Process Studies had him at a conference um, to talk with Whiteheadians, I think in the 80s.
mm,
And he really wanted there to be real creativity, but he didn't see how it could be possible given,
mm,
the way that his metaphysics and physics worked. And that's the rub, because for Whitehead, yeah, time is creative advance.
mm,
It's a cumulative process, and that's why nothing ever repeats. Um, and so you end up, just as in Einstein's block universe with the Bohmian approach, having to say that time, I mean, this would be my understanding at least, that time is some kind of, as Einstein put it, a stubbornly persistent illusion.
mm,
Um, Whereas Whitehead would say uh, time is real, and that the reason he has these actual occasions, which are uh, individuations in a sense, like to use like a term from Simondon, and who was another process thinker, but concrescence does create it's the production of novelty, of a novel individual perspective that has never existed before.
mm,
And it's a momentary process. So as, it, as soon as that process of concrescence has achieved satisfaction, in using Whitehead's terms, a new value and a new perspective is added to the whole of things. And so Whitehead is a holistic thinker, but his whole is always growing
mm,
dropwise at the
mm,
edges with these concressing actual occasions. And that's a cumulative process whereby, we can understand the whole universe as recapitulating itself, everything which has occurred in the past in
mm,
each new occasion, but always with the injection of novelty, which does come through his eternal objects, and the primordial nature of God. And there's a lot of moving pieces here. And one could say, parsimony, Whitehead, do you really need all of these things?
mm,
And maybe the Hegelian approach is simpler. I'm open to that. But the idea would be that if actual occasions are not externally related to future possibilities, then yeah, we're in a deterministic universe, and maybe that's um, a pill you're willing to swallow. I think
mm. Oh, yes.
yeah, it's a respectable position, but it's
Mm,
certainly not the process, or at least the Whiteheadian version of process's position.
mm.
Yeah.
There's a lot of different pieces there. Real briefly, I can say I've become a kind of presentist then, and the present though needs to be some order of thickness, so it dilates with regard for the organization of some system. So what distinguishes emergent phenomena as being emergent is the duration of process that has to take place because of the organization. So it takes time for a thought to occur because neurons are communicating in a very intricate way across that space. And that effectively dilates time. So certain kinds of complex emergent phenomena, that's basically what they're doing. So the ontology that I'm working with ends up being different orders of time functions for different kinds of phenomena. And then the question we have to ask is like, how does some change um, ripple through a given system of a certain kind of organization. It takes time for certain changes to take place. And that brings us to the question of synthesis, like how then can we bring together genuine new things that are contributing something good. You have to define good and all, but the time stuff all becomes very thick, and I'd like to move to something a little bit lighter for the present conversation. um, there's a couple other things that I think we can more joyfully move through, I think. But so yeah, the appeal to abstract forms, the ideas of God. How do you put them? What are they for Whitehead and for you?
Uh, he calls them eternal objects,
Is
and they are inherited in each concressing actual occasions
is
experience through apprehension of the primordial nature of God. So it's
mhm,
very Platonic in a sense.
mhm.
The ideas are in the mind of God.
It,
Um, Whitehead inverts the priority of the forms versus the actual occasions
mm,
from the Platonic picture, but nonetheless,
mm,
the basic structure is that. Yeah.
right. So, uh, right. What I wonder, what does that give us in terms of thinking about a trajectory? Like, I guess a trajectory that would be normative. So if we're working with that, um, the curious thing to me is that we don't, as individuals, it doesn't seem that we actually have access to those eternal uh, ideas or forms. Um, eh, but we have partial access to them, perhaps, just in terms of the kinds of forms that we have developed an understanding of throughout our lives. What's going on there? What's the relationship between the forms that we have a grasp of and the eternal forms?
So most of, I mean, the realm of eternal objects in Whitehead's view would be infinite, and
Hmm,
the primordial nature of God is conceptually prehending the entire infinite realm and giving it a kind of um, tilt toward value and order and truth, beauty, and goodness, let's say.
hmm,
Um, Now, finite occasions, when we feel that primordial, Whitehead uses the term envisagement of the realm of eternal objects. Most of that infinite realm of forms, he would say we're negatively prehending, or
hmm,
you could say we're unconscious of that. We can
hmm,
only consider what's relevant to our given finite situation in an excess of other occasions in space time. And so we are aware of eternal objects,
hmm,
but the primordial nature of God functions to kind of filter out everything that's not the majority of eternal objects, which are not relevant to our unique situation. But there's still a creative role for each occasion of experience to play in selecting and interpreting among that relevant subset of eternal objects, what to what to ingress into its experience and decide upon as how it's going to characterize its experience, which then
hmm,
becomes part of its satisfaction that would be inherited by the next actual occasion. And so there's a constant sort of drawing down of possibility into actuality by the decisions that each
hmm,
occasion makes as to which forms, right, to incarnate into itself. But for Whitehead, the forms are any characterization that we give of our experience is going to come in the form of internal objects, whether they're
hmm.
mathematical or qualitative. Yeah.
Hmm. It seems like we could describe the events of material events or just events that science studies, whatever they are, as always in line with what came previously. So it seems to me very naively that if that kind of process were taking place, where each event was in some sense drawing from eternal objects, we would see a lot more randomness in the world and things that were like completely incongruent with the past. But because we can always connect whatever happens to exactly the history of that event, it's like there's the reasoning ends up being the relationship of forms and processes of that given history, and nothing else. There's anything else would be superfluous to my mind, and that seems equally the case for human beings and for any other inanimate object.
Whitehead would say there are grades of actual occasions, and that in the physical world that physics studies, mostly there's repetition, there's
Mm,
conformity to the past, and very little in the way of the ingression of novelty, of novel forms. But that, as evolution transpires and complexity increases, you get actual occasions whose uh, organismic context uh, grants them the ability to ingress greater novelty. And so, yes, if actual occasions operative in the inorganic physical world were as high grade as the occasions associated with human consciousness, we would expect to see a lot more randomness, and science would likely be impossible because there'd be no
mm,
widespread laws. Whitehead would say widespread habits, really, because he would be in agreement with people like Lee Smolin, cosmologists nowadays like Lee Smolin, who think that law evolves over the course of cosmic
mm,
history. Similar to Peirce in
mm.
that respect.
That's another point of agreement between us, actually.
Mm,
So I argued for that in chapter 5 of my book. That also seems to follow from a lot of what Harris wrote, but Harris didn't make that point exactly, but he said a lot of things that were exactly consistent with it and seemed to point in the direction of what kind of arguments could be made to support the idea. So I tried to actually appeal a little bit to Smolin and uh, yeah, some others that actually make similar ideas. And it does also seem to follow from the extrapolation of complexity theory to the cosmos. That is exactly, there's actually some folks that have directly said that, writing from a vantage point of systems biology. They've sort of gone back and said, well, this is probably what nature is something like this. That shows up in the biological chapters of a 2011 handbook on complex systems and philosophy. Uh, yeah, so yeah, I wonder though, is there any kind of ethical implication or some sort of normative implication, maybe for how we should do philosophy itself, that follows from that basic structure of reality, of prehension and all of that?
uh, I mean, absolutely. I was just rereading Whitehead's first lecture at Harvard University in 1924, and at the end of that, uh, he says he says the following as a kind of metaphilosophical, um, you know, principle we should keep in mind. He says, "I have an immense distrust of all-inclusive neat systems which profess to finish up the philosophical problem in well-chosen explanations.
Mm,
I hold that every system of philosophy, if it be properly expounded, should show on the face of it that it is dealing with a few aspects of a limitless interplay of relations. It is for this reason that the philosophy of any age is so intensely characteristic of the inward motives and outlook of that age." And he gets pretty Hegelian here. It
mm,
emphasizes those relations of things which fill the mind of the age. The philosophy prevalent during a period of history is the autobiography of its time spirit. So there's both something Hegelian in that, but
mm,
also at least critique of the caricatures of Hegel as having produced an all-inclusive need system,
mm,
um, which might not be fair. I know there are other readings of Hegel as suggesting a more openness in that the dialectic continues, but others would say no, he thought history ended, at least
mm,
in at least the idea of history ended, if not in fact, um, when he completes his system.
mm,
But I think, as a process thinker, with the ultimate category in his scheme being creativity,
mm,
Whitehead is well aware that, I mean, he doesn't even call his system a system. He calls it a scheme. It's a
mm,
scheme of ideas. And in the midst of writing Process and Reality, well, first of all, he includes a category of existence, namely contrasts, which he says allows for an indefinite um, addition of other categories. And then I think it's on page 250, he abolishes one of his categories of explanation and says, oh, actually, we can explain this more simply without that category. And so the point is, he's kind of exemplifying for us the way in which this scheme that he has laid out is offered as a sort of pragmatic approach to these deep issues that should be applicable and um, applicable to experience uh, and always answerable to experience, and that we shouldn't be afraid to hack the system or the scheme, as it were. And so he really wants to leave things open-ended,
Mm,
um, rather than think we could have a neat, tidy system. And he kind of learned his lesson with Principia, I think,
mm.
on that front.
Sure. Yeah, this is a huge, a lot of room, right, between this sort of closed system that Principio is aiming for and the sort of openness that you just articulated. It would seem to me that there is need for some kind of constraint that gives a path, a particular path, so that you know that you're making progress, like coming up with new things, new distinctions. That in itself could be absolutely terrible. I mean, if just left unconstrained, right? Because it would produce this like wild pluralistic way of doing philosophy where there's no truth and everyone is relative to everyone else, and it would just be madness, it would seem to me.
Well, I mean, Whitehead says that um, philosophy plays this mediating role between common sense and scientific specialization,
Hmm,
and he really thinks that the modern period has what's been typical during the modern period is this runaway scientific abstraction, which has continually dismissed and denigrated common sense.
hmm,
And we've ended up in a situation where we've sawed the branch that we're perched on off,
hmm,
because all
hmm,
science rests in upon experience.
hmm. Right.
And common sense can be challenged by new discoveries and new ideas, but it can't be so humiliated that we're just easily dismissing everything that human beings experience and perceive as an illusion,
Hmm,
even if it's a controlled hallucination or
hmm.
controlled illusion, as
Good.
Emil Zeff likes to say. So, Whitehead is a pragmatist and a radical empiricist, and wants to take common sense uh, seriously, not as something that can't be challenged sort of around the edges, but uh, there are certain hardcore common sense presuppositions that even science can't get behind or underneath or before.
Hmm,
And so he wants to defend common sense in that respect. And he's got criteria for speculative philosophy that he lays out at the
hmm,
beginning of Process and Reality, right? There are the rational criteria of logical consistency and coherence, and
hmm,
there are the empirical criteria of uh, experiential adequacy and applicability, right? So the categories should be adequate to experience, and they should apply to all known examples uh,
hmm.
that experience throws at us.
Okay.
And so Whitehead would say if we meet something in experience that these categories are not applicable to or inadequate for elucidating, then
Hmm,
the scheme is broken, not experience.
hmm.
uh,
Good. Right. So I think that's a pretty good place to have to expand on this one particular question I wanted to ask you. I also went through the blind spot ahead of this conversation because I wanted to have things to talk about. I agree with you and your review of it that they didn't really provide much in the way of anything in terms of moving forward, moving beyond it. So they kind of did in the last chapter on the Earth, uh, talking about um, how the blind spot leads to self-destructive dynamics and how we can use other accounts of ourself that are based in dynamical systems thinking that gives rise to autopoiesis to conceptualize ourselves as internally related to our environments, etc. To actually have a better framework for how not to destroy ourselves. That's cool. But one of the blind spots they had was, interestingly, that in the physics section, they didn't really work out what kind of framework, metaphysical framework could fill in the blind spot. They just sort of gestured at being aware that we are using statistical tools and that we're not actually describing reality, something along those lines. It's like, oh, great, that's nice. We should do that, yes. But they only really offered something substantial from like life through to the end. But nothing, and all of that is nevertheless a kind of metaphysical framing, I think. But how do you think, whether from Whitehead or yourself, how do you think um, a process philosophy could add more and kind of go beyond the blind spot from where they left off?
Yeah, great question. To their credit, they do in the physics section of the book talk about time,
Mm,
and they get into the Bergson Einstein uh, encounter disagreement. I hesitate to call it a debate because
mm,
Einstein barely said two sentences uh, to dismiss Bergson's idea that there is such a thing as the philosopher's time.
mm,
Uh, Einstein would say there's only psychological time, which is an illusion, and there's the time of a physicist, which is what clocks measure. And they really get into that issue, and I think make it clear that, and there are two physicists as co-authors, right? And so it's great
mm,
to see this recognition that what is measured by clocks is not at all the end of the story as regards the
mm,
phenomenology of
mm,
time. Um, and and so even if Bergson did, unfortunately, in his book Duration and Simultaneity, misunderstand the thought experiment of the twin
mm,
paradox. Um, Nonetheless, Bergson's aim was never to challenge Einstein's physics, but
mm,
to really draw out the implications of it, and to have a more relational epistemology to go along with the relativistic physics.
mm,
Um, but in any event, I think their focus on time got them a little bit further towards really wiping away that residue of scientific materialism and blind spot metaphysics.
mm,
But certainly we can go further, because with the approach that they take, we end up with a new explanatory gap
mm,
between the living world and neutral physics and chemistry, as Varela puts it in one of his late papers. Uh, and so it seems to me that that gap between life, or the autonomy of biological systems and their autopoiesis, and sense making, that gap is just as severe as the old mind matter, mind body gap that left us with the hard problem. And so while they might, with the continuity thesis, that you know cognition is coextensive with life, I think that's a major step forward. uh but where does life come from? And they spend
mm,
literally two sentences on the origin of life, but in their framework, that that gap between chemical reaction and autocatalysis and autopoiesis is quite profound, and
mm,
they don't seem to me to dwell enough on the miracle that would need to transpire for us to go from a physical world with no horizon of experience, with no autopoiesis. Maybe it has self-organization and there are dissipative
mm,
structures and so on in the inorganic world, but the kind of horizon of concern and subjective point of view that seems to occur because of autopoiesis is, as they've laid it out, miraculous, right? And
mm,
there's no account of that gap. And
mm,
I think, Whitehead bites the bullet in a sense and just affirms a panexperientialist ontology.
mm,
And, that comes with its own issues, certainly, but there's no explanatory gap anymore.
mm,
Um, and I know that at least Evan Thompson has been moving more in that direction. He's at least willing to adopt a kind of neutral monism and
mm,
say that, whatever being is, it is somehow um, neither material nor mental, but something neutral in between, uh, which is an improvement, but it's still too um, yeah, quietist for me, I guess. I think
mm.
we can and need to say more.
Yeah.
Um, so
And the main point of my book was to lay out what that neutral monism would be. Evan has never responded to it. But I started where he left off, which was saying that there needs to be some kind of neutral domain. So first of all, we can recognize that it's process for many reasons. That seems to just be a result of kind of extrapolating backwards into the foundation of an activist reasoning, where they start in phenomenology, which is that we can't get away from the idea that all experience is various kinds of process. And that's just a matter of characterizing what is the most general kind of process that we can refer to. The important move for me is, as I said, not to project features of experience into that thing. So what we end up with are various kinds of morphology. And basically, we're identifying in and through science new kinds of forms and self-organization or transformation. And what we're trying to do is collect through lines where we can use an understanding of one such organization or morphology or process to make sense of another context, another kind of phenomenon. So we're overlapping what is essentially the self-differentiation of concept as we identify it in one domain with another domain to get insights. The asymmetries between the two are what bring about the insight. The insight is that this domain is undergoing a different kind of process because of various reasons, like different kinds of orders of time or temporal scale. But it seems to me that the idea of just the different parameters for the different scales of space and time, that actually seems to be neutral when we abstract it in this way. It seems neutral to our experience or to nature itself. And we can use that to try to inform what it is that being is doing, because effectively the only way we can understand being is various forms of differentiation. And so there's no need in that schema to talk about like forms that are outside of what will be produced or have ever been produced throughout the history of being. Whatever that is, it's all continuous and it's all part of one process, one single self-differentiation. That is an attempt to go through it in a brief kind of way. So it seems to me more parsimonious, and there's no need for Panexperientialism when we think about what's going on in being. It's just the self-differentiation as a process of forms. Yeah, and then we make various kinds of predictions and abstractions of it.
Yeah, I think, in Process and Reality, Whitehead has in part 3 and part 4, he lays out these two different modes of analysis. Part 3 is on the theory of prehensions, and part 4 is on the theory of extension. And basically, the morphological account, which is what I hear you describing, Whitehead would say is a form of coordinate analysis of what has already concressed, as it were.
Mm.
Even though, and that's how science, physics measures the world, and gives us the models that we know and love that come out of the natural sciences. It's doing coordinate analysis of the morphology of the natural world as objectified. It's kind of like nature natured, natura naturata, right? So the outside of nature. But he thinks there's also this other kind of analysis, which he calls genetic analysis, different from Husserl's, which is the analysis of what's going on inside of concrescence. And we know concrescence from a first person point of view in our own experience. And so whenever we're doing science and doing coordinate analysis of the morphology of nature, presupposed in that is always our own experience concressing from moment to moment. So there's always concrescence, even in the morphological account. It's just backgrounded. That's nature naturing concrescence, right? And so the consciousness of the scientist is always engaged in that process of concrescence, but for the purposes of measuring the morphology of the already actualized bodies of the physical world, that process of concrescence is backgrounded. But when we're analyzing a concrescence, we're looking at prehensions, and there's an experiential process underway. And Whitehead thinks that we can generalize from our own first person experience of that process of feeling and experience to other self-organizing systems in nature. Even if we can't measure that morphologically, we can through a kind, I think it's been referred to by some process thinkers as a kind of speculative empiricism. Um, Schelling wrote about metaphysical empiricism in his late work. I think it's a similar notion that we're distilling our own very high grade complex form of human experience down to its basic elements that we can then justifiably see at work in other self-organizing systems in nature,
mm,
below quote unquote the human level.
mm.
Certainly in the animal world, the rest of the biological world, but perhaps even uh, further than that.
So the inside of a concrescence for us, that that also involves the same kinds of forms that we would identify in empirical processes and structures. Like how else could it be characterized? I wonder.
Well, so Whitehead has this other category of societies, and
Hmm,
so the enduring bodies around us, tables and chairs, plants, animals, our own bodies, are societies of actual occasions, and so it's a whole series of concrescences that inherit some definite characteristic or some definite form
hmm,
through time. Whereas concrescence is more of it's not an instant, but it's Whitehead says concrescence is not in an already constituted timeline. The process of concrescence gives rise to uh, metrical time or chronological time.
hmm.
Um,
Well,
so yeah,
yeah, what's the content of the inside of a concrescent event? Um, and how is that content different from other kinds of content that you might use to say, talk about the the kind of object I'm looking at, I guess.
well, Whitehead would say it's actually more concrete. The content of a concrescence would be its prehensions or its feelings.
Hmm,
Um, and when we look at the normal everyday objects of our sensory experience, um, we're seeing that same content, but where because of certain habits of thought, which are not just a function of our language, but probably um, biological evolution, avoiding predators and finding prey and whatnot, we tend to uh, view the world abstractly through what he calls symbolic reference, where we think that the content of our experience of another body, its color, its shape, and whatnot, are actually um, inhering in some enduring body, and we think that that enduring body is what's real. And his metaphysics is suggesting that what's concrete, if we're going to ask the question like what is really going on here, is that moment by moment there is a new achievement um, of being that appears to us abstractly as an enduring entity, but concretely is actually just this process of concressing, pulsing into existence
hmm,
over and over again, inheriting a past with more or less conformity. Um, Less conformity in the case of living organisms because there is a lot of creativity manifest in the living world that, for example, doesn't allow us to understand biology in a mathematical way like we can understand much of physics.
hmm,
But there's two levels to Whitehead's ontology here, right? There's societies, which is most of what our sense experience makes the world appear to be. Um, and he's taking the idea of society from human groups and sociology and generalizing that to groups of actual
hmm,
occasions at any scale, right? And then there's this other level of actual occasions, which is more of a speculative hypothesis because it's not as directly evident in our everyday experience. We experience societies, we experience our own stream of consciousness, which is another phrase for society would be a historical root.
hmm,
And so we experience ourselves as extended in time. Whitehead saying we could do a finer analysis of experience and see that it comes in this pulse-like way. And he gives phenomenological reasons for why we should think of it like this. He draws on James, who also has a similar kind of sense of drops of experience. Um, but there's also logical reasons having to do with Zeno's paradox and other things.
hmm.
Um, so there's a lot of background there, but yeah, those are the two basic levels of his ontology.
Uh, the idea of a society is generally, I think, consistent with the way I've been thinking about it and what Harris worked out. So in Harris's terminology, the closest thing to a society would be a unifying principle. And in systems theory, you get order parameters and control parameters. So there's something that results through the interaction of various components interacting with each other that creates a constraint. And the constraint is historically founded, and it's spatiotemporally embedded, and it creates a trajectory. So phenomena are what they are, it would seem to me, because of a certain kind of unifying principle that is characteristic of that phenomenon. And it is creating the trajectories that we see through time. That is, yeah, specific to them. And that seems pretty similar anyway to Whitehead's idea of a society. But the whole notion of the internal process and like the reference to eternal objects or to the past again, I'm not, I don't understand it. I'm not sure how to make sense of it, actually. Like some of those pieces are pretty good, and I think that I can translate them. And I've tried to do that in the past with a bit of Whitehead that I've read, like the drops of experience and all that. That's pretty cool. And a lot of that seems closest to what Bohm was on about, with some various transformations, though. But the important thing about unifying principles is that they always have to be understood as a kind of manifestation of the whole of being. So in a fractal sense, they're like partial reflections of the whole. So we then are always projecting a conception of some kind. And that's really important. So the unifying principles that we identify, the forms of trajectories through time, they are a result of our capacity to conceptualize up to that point, right? And at the same time, they are a reflection of the differentiation, the self-differentiation and evolution of being up to that point. So the two are importantly very closely tied together. So of course we might be wrong, and we can learn more about history and about the trajectories of being. And in doing so, the concept that we're using to characterize these unifying principles and trajectories through time are themselves becoming more nuanced. And so the goal for metaphysics, as far as I understand it and what Harris was trying to get at, is to clarify and bring about more nuance for those conceptualizations. So the evolution of consciousness is the evolution of concept through the increasing identification of unifying principles, which is the individuation of being.
Yeah, no, I appreciate the effort to draw connections to Harris's ideas. Like you, with Whitehead, I haven't steeped myself in Harris enough to know, how to take that any further. But I thought of these lines in, again, the first part of Process and Reality, just page 12, where Whitehead explains kind of what's going on as we try to translate between these two metaphysical schemes. He says, the technical language of philosophy represents attempts of various schools of thought to obtain explicit expression of general ideas presupposed by the facts of experience. It follows that any novelty in metaphysical doctrines exhibits some measure of disagreement with statements of the facts to be found in current philosophical literature. The extent of disagreement measures the extent of metaphysical divergence. It is therefore no valid criticism of one metaphysical school to point out that its doctrines do not follow from the verbal expressions of the facts accepted by another school. The whole contention is that the doctrines in question supply a closer approach to fully expressed propositions. And he says earlier that, we can never hope to fully make explicit all the propositions that are implicit in the categories we've laid out, in this metaphysics. And so Whitehead thinks there's always something about, this is his empiricist side, there's always something about the depth of experience that will exceed our ability to conceptualize. And yet we can never stop attempting to do so. It's kind of a Kantian thing there, I guess. at least the part of Kant, that says that we're kind of doomed to do metaphysics, even though we're limited in these ways that prevent us from ever finishing that project.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah, I can appreciate that. That I'm definitely on board with that endeavor. One thing that strikes me is that your conception of how, like the direction that we should go, it seems that the one of the most important things that needs to be addressed is the underdetermination of theory by evidence. So it seems like you could do everything, as far as I understand it, that Whitehead suggests that we do in order to endeavor upon metaphysical work or philosophical work. Uh, and the consequence will certainly be a sort of differentiation of different theoretical orientations, and they will be consistent with observation. They'll be equally able to account for the same observation, but they'll have different accounts of what the world is. I suppose this speaks to the issue of pluralism. And this is one thing that I wanted to talk to you about. On the one hand, I can say that so my position isn't pluralist in the sense that I think we have to presume a coherent, unified being. Otherwise, we run the risk of ending up in a relativist territory of like admitting that that indeed truth is just completely separate things that are incongruent with each other, and that's just the way it is. But at the same time, there needs to be some kind of procedure by which we bring about increasing coherence because we're never able to achieve perfect coherence, right? So that's where I find myself, and I wonder from a Whiteheadian perspective, your position, Whitehead's position, or anyone working in process philosophy today, like how does that issue show up, or how is it dealt with?
well, I mean, I like Peirce's idea of truth as something that the scientific and philosophical community in the
Mm,
future will continue to converge upon, right? There's a kind of intersubjective convergence that we have faith in that process,
mm,
um, even if we have to be very careful in any given um, moment in history to not think that we've arrived.
mm,
Um, and so there needs to be room for that kind of uh, asymptotic growth towards ever and ever
mm,
more inclusive forms of truth. Um, but yeah, Whitehead does. He's defending a kind of what you could call ontological pluralism, which
mm,
sounds to some people like an oxymoron because reality is obviously got to be one
mm,
unified being. Um, but if we take the creative process seriously, that being reality, yes, it's one, it's whole, but it's self-differentiating um, infinitely. And
mm,
so, from Whitehead's point of view, we need to, creativity is both many and one, he'll
mm,
say. Similarly, God is both one and many, one in
mm,
the primordial nature, but many in the consequent nature, which is this other pole of God that feels everything that finite actual occasions feel, and brings them into some coherence. And so there's a unity side to the divine and a multiplicity side to the
mm,
divine. Um, and so I mean I think of what Whitehead's really attempting as it's this Hegelian move of seeking some synthesis between identity and difference.
mm,
Um, and so pluralism is, I think, an important part of the ethics of knowledge,
mm,
whether or not it is fully ontological. I mean, I have in a uh, provocative when I'm in a provocative mood tried to defend a kind of ontological pluralism, but it's not because I'm trying to encourage a kind of anarchic free for all. I
mm,
think that if if the world is made of, if we approach this like a Nietzschean perspectivism or something, which Whitehead's ontology is similar, those perspectives are not solipsistic. They'll overlap more or less because again, there's all these internal relations um, that allow the universe, even in its perspectivalism, to be a network.
mm,
Um, and so there's more or less overlap between these perspectives. And it's the kind of pluralism where you can't, like, every perspective knows that there are other perspectives that it only has a partial perspective on, right? So there's a built-in sense of my perspective is not the whole,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
And so yeah, it's a tough problem though.
It
You know,
is very tough. This seems to me to be one of the most important problems, and it also, and the reason for that is because I've been driven to be increasingly reflective about the conditions of philosophy working at all. And it seems that for the most part, academia is not a good environment for philosophy to flourish in. So you could, I think, just playing the kind of devil's advocate, you could take the criteria presented in a lot of philosophies, Whiteheads perhaps, and say, is this criteria being met for philosophy to be done, to be working? And it might actually be that all the criteria are actually satisfied in academia, yet academia is so incredibly fragmented that it certainly is not genuinely progressing. It's just creating more and more idiosyncratic domains of research and people seeking funding. And there's lots of problems there where people are getting really, really good at doing certain things, but it's not really integrating a wide range of perspectives, or creating genuine differentiation. For instance, to new fields that are actually new fields. I mean, sometimes this works, but it really just seems that there's a lot of work that needs to be done in order to say what is required for synthesis to occur. That seems the most important thing that is missing in a lot of like metaphilosophical discussions or considerations of the conditions of philosophy itself. It's like it won't just happen on its own. It almost seems as though we can mechanistically carry on creating new theories and trying to correspond them to observations or to experiences. And that in itself is like 50% of what is required for actual progress. And in fact, by itself, it might lead to very destructive ends.
yeah, I mean, I'm probably just as um, concerned about the state of academic philosophy as you are, but I'm more hopeful about philosophy as such, because I think, part of the challenge here is articulating a truly world philosophy and not just a Western uh, perspective on these questions.
Mm,
And that's only really been, I mean, the Silk Road was, the cultural exchange was happening thousands of years ago, but it's only in with the German idealists that there's this real influx of the translation of Vedic texts and this real meeting of East and West where you begin to get a sense of um, philosophy as a truly planetary
mm,
project.
mm,
And but back then, obviously, it was very Eurocentric,
mm,
and so there wasn't a real meeting on equal terms quite yet. But I
mm,
think now, and this may or may not happen in the context of universities. I see it increasingly. I see philosophy increasingly being pushed out of
mm,
universities, which on the one hand is a terrible thing,
mm,
but on the other hand, universities have created this suffocating research culture that's more about knowledge production than it is about the love of wisdom.
mm,
And it's very competitive, and um, lots of papers get written that not a lot of people ever read, and
mm.
you start to wonder what it's all for. And
Right.
so while I really um, resist the idea of philosophy being pushed out of university education because it doesn't lead to a job or whatever. On the other hand, when I see what's happening um, online, and we're in some sense in the golden age of autodidact, philosophical uh, education. That's yeah,
Mm,
it's not happening in the university. Maybe it's less. I mean, it is less rigorous than your average PhD program, but
mm,
there's such a hunger for ideas and for philosophy as a way of life and in the ancient
mm,
mode, and that seems to me to be flourishing
mm.
outside the universities.
Yeah.
And it's very pluralistic, and it's very um even transcultural, and there's lots
Mm,
of problems, lots of shallowness, lots of cliches and memes, and
mm,
but I'm not. Um, I'll say I do have some hope for the future of philosophy, even if it doesn't survive in the university context. Um,
That's good.
yeah, because
Hmm.
the like pluralism is both a challenge to be worked with and I think a fact about the human condition,
Mm,
right? And so, um, yes, I do naturally instinctually seek synthesis and integration, but I try to do so with great care um, I I never imagine there isn't something more I haven't left out, you know,
mm.
without realizing it.
Yeah. One of the unifying uh, principles or moves that could be made to understand, I think, the nature of the plurality and how to work with it is that we share a context. Like the, it's similar to the idea of saying, where have we all come from? It must be one being that has given rise to this differences, all these differences, all this difference of perspective. Uh, to keep in mind that ultimately, like the broadest sense of context is something that we must by necessity share, is I think to orient us to the idea that, well, that should mean that our different perspectives should be convergent under some translation. And then it's a matter of asking, how can we discover better translations and syntheses to bring that about? It seems like that's ultimately the work that we should be doing. And what's important, what one thing that I'd want to emphasize is that it seems to me that that kind of effort toward translation does not bring to like a myopic perspective. It leads us to actually the very conditions that give rise to new disciplines, new theories, new philosophies entirely, because you always end up with a slight asymmetry, and that asymmetry gives rise to a new space. Like if you and I come from completely different philosophical orientations and we have different languages and we identify something, and we it seems that that something is a common thing, but we've described it differently. That opens up a new space potentially, especially when we can then say, what is it that your language is not accounting for that mine is, and vice versa. There's some sensitivity, there's some nuance, there's some, yeah, some sort of relationships that are being left out that are somewhat blind to the other. And we can lean into that. And then I would try to account for what I'm missing with my own language. And perhaps this would eventually give rise to completely new languages. I think that it's important to pay attention to like, what are the actual conditions of giving rise to new theoretical lenses? And I think roughly this is the trajectory that leads to it. And there's a lot of other ways of doing it where it's just endless like arbitrary distinction in order to create new spaces of discussion. And this is effectively the fragmentary situation we find in academia, where people can kind of create new fields or new areas, but they're running the risk of reinventing the wheel because they're driven to do that for financial purposes, to just make something sound like it's novel by using language in a new way. But only through this kind of genuine synthesis, I think we can make real progress.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it seems to me that a true Hegelian should be seeking out those perspectives which seem to be different from its own,
Mhm,
uh, because it's there precisely that uh, the new synthesis would come
mhm,
bring forth a whole new shape of consciousness as a result of that encounter. Um, and so, there's all sorts of caricatures of Hegel as um, just blindly seeing synthesis everywhere, and
mhm,
but he's very careful to say we have to stay with the negative and really work through difference
mhm,
and not rush the process of sublation.
mhm.
Um,
Yep. Yeah, the dialectic evolves by the condition of negation in some sense. And it appears to me that one way to think about that is that analytic philosophy and the contrarian nature of it, that's actually what they've like overplayed and overemphasized to their detriment. But that seems to be the condition of real like of evolution of concept and of our horizon, is to use that, but use it only in the right way. We also need to actually like exercise phenomenological understanding of the other's perspective, as much as possible in order to understand how it is that they arrived at the belief and the perspective that they have at that moment, because that's the truth of reality, is precisely what a person gives you. We just need to figure out how to contextualize it appropriately, I think. That's one thing that I can say. And we're continually trying to do that, to fit what is presented into a more coherent whole.
Yeah, Whitehead says something like, that, logic and logical analysis is the most, powerful instrument that human thought has yet devised, but it's a real shame that none of the logicians agree with each other about
Mm,
its results. You
mhm.
know,
That's
there are
funny.
many different kinds of logic and
Mm,
whatnot nowadays. But so I have to run here in a minute, but I think we really need to do another session, James, because there's a lot more here to discuss. I want to dig
sure.
into your book.
Mm,
Um, I sent you a link to it's a chapter of mine
mm,
that'll be in a book on Cambridge idealism
mm,
that's called uh, Whitehead's Philosophy of Organism, Turning Idealism Inside Out. And
mhm,
it's a comparison of Whitehead and F.H. Bradley, and through Bradley, Hegel, and uh, offers a sort of what's a history of Whitehead's engagement with Russell and the analytic school of thought, but shows how and why he diverged from Russell after the Principia project sort of failed. And it might provide us with some more grist to chew
mm,
on together in terms of what Whitehead's method is and what
mm,
his uh, understanding of process ontology ends up looking like versus what a Hegelian approach would look like. I think it might form the basis um, a great part two here. And I'll have
mm.
dug into your book a bit as well before we speak again,
Yeah,
so we can
I,
take
I
this deeper.
I read that paper with
Oh,
my
cool.
partner actually, and then we had a nice long discussion about it while
Oh, cool.
driving across to Western Massachusetts. It was fun. Yeah, I have various questions about descendental realism, and some of the conclusions and conceptions of God. That was good. I was hoping to get into that as well. Yeah, there's only one other thing that I wanted to make sure I pitched. So usually it has to do with something of like shameless self-promotion or so. But so I've
Do it.
recently been associated with ART Solutions, which is a academic contracting and analysis. So basically, my capacity there is to provide support for PhD or master students in any qualitative humanities field doing ethnographic work or philosophical analysis of any kind. So essentially, you can reach out to them, and the idea is that I would be paired uh, with you and work you to the finish line of your PhD or any kind of thesis. And I'm interested to know if anyone has any sense of the need for that, or how that can be done better, or would like to talk to me about anything, yourself included. Yeah, I'd be happy to get into that. That is the way to pivot away from depending on academia, essentially. Yep. And it does seem to be something kind of on the rise as well. Yep.
Yeah, I mean, those types of mentorship relationships are so important. And ideally you would get that in graduate school with
Mm,
the supervisor, but uh,
mm.
that's very expensive or
So yeah, a
time
lot of
consuming.
uh, advisors are now reaching out to contractors because they don't have time, or yeah, they just don't have the capacity to supervise to the extent that they need. And that's why these kinds of contractors are becoming more important and even called for by the advisors themselves, actually.
Yeah. Well, give me a link for that and I'll
Mhm.
drop that in the notes for
Sure.
this.
Yeah, I'd be
And
happy to talk with you more about your paper and anything you find in my book as well.
Awesome. Yeah, let's find a time in the next several weeks to do a part two. This was really fun. Thanks for taking the time. I
Sure.
enjoyed this.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right.